He's here in Paris for the French presidency of the G7's International Roundtable on Social Dialogue, hosted by the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po. Marcos Neto, you're the United Nations Assistant Secretary General, also the UNDP, the UN's Development Program's Director for Policy and Program Support. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
We talked about a manic Monday on world oil markets. It must be a manic Monday for those who are trying to figure out what is energy security, like yourself.
Oh, I think we need to look at, the importance role that organizations like United Nations Development Program plays in context as the ones that we are living today. Energy security is very important, is fundamental for development. At the end of the day, I think we are living in a world where we have a crisis of development, right? Development is something that creates a stability. It is no longer a soft power. It's a first line of defense. And I think we need to look at what is going on in the world as an opportunity to reimagine development as a way that can bring stability to a world that we need it a lot more than what we have it right now.
And so that energy security, you're saying this could be an opportunity. How could this war and the closing of the Strait of Hormuz or the disruption of it be an opportunity?
Oh, I think the opportunity comes when it's all relatively settled right now. How can we provide, countries in the region, long-standing reconstruction deals that can actually create jobs, that can allow younger populations to be stable and to have a job, that can deal with all the tensions in societies that we've seen in those countries. Right now, we're dealing with the Strait of Hormuz in other aspects is beyond any single organization's capacity.
So Reconstruction, what countries are you thinking of specifically?
Oh, let me give you an example, right? Energy security, Ukraine. We have been working in Ukraine for a long, long time. And we have been working on the energy. As the energy grid in Ukraine falters, as energy supplies is hit, UNDP with partners is actually bringing back energy, right? And installing battery capacities and other elements that allow for the country to function. Now, you transpose some of those elements to the countries affected today or to other parts of the world, and I think we need to start looking at energy security as a mix. Let's not forget that, renewable energy and a transition to renewable energy, in the end, it's also an energy security strategy. And I think we are very much involved in bringing that transition to renewable energy as fast as we can, as much as possible all over the world. Because we are talking about energy security in a very geographical moment right now. But energy security is everywhere, right? And I think, as you described in many market on Monday on oil, it affects the whole world, right? So I think looking at renewable again as an energy security strategy is going to become an important element.
But we've heard the whole of the past year, the President of the United States disparaging the switch to renewables.
Well, all that I can tell you is that the private sector knows that renewable energy sources, solar, wind, are the most profitable and cheapest energy sources, and they are investing on this.
In the short term, it's going to be about filling stop gaps. It doesn't happen overnight, this transition that you describe. We know parts of Southeast Asia are very worried, not just India and China, but also other nations, South Asia as well. They need oil and gas right now. What's the UNDP's word of advice, especially to countries that might be tempted to, say, take the money they would have put in development programs and use it to subsidize oil and gas, which to keep the price from going up too much?
Look, we work in 170 countries. We are long-standing partners of governors all over the world. And I think the advice we are giving them is don't forgo long-term development strategies. Right, the cycles of the market comes and goes. The cycles of geopolitics comes and goes, and countries have to own their own resilience. Right, let's not forget that you still have a crisis on climate change, and you still have to protect your economies, right, and prepare your economies.
Are you being heard?
I think, look, the UN system and the multilateral system is under strain. I think we all know that.
Yeah.
However, I am from Belém. I was at the COP in Belém, and agreements were done. The multilateral system still is working. The Paris Agreement is still working. We are in Paris. 10 years ago, the Paris Agreement took place here, and is still working, despite everything else. And I think we need to hang hope to those elements.
Marcos Neto, you mentioned how reconstruction is one of the remits of the United Nations Development Program. When you look at countries like Iran, but also places like the Gaza Strip, you talked about the UN not having the best of years with being sidelined, particularly with this Board of Peace that was put in by Donald Trump. What are your ambitions as an organization for places like Gaza, for Iran, after the fighting stops, as you say?
Well, all that I can tell you is in Gaza right now, we've already removed 82,000 tons of debris. And we're going to carry on doing it, right? That is the first thing that needs to happen on reconstruction. In Turkey, right, after the earthquake, we support the government in removing thousands and thousands of tons of debris and then recycle that debris back into housing and back into reconstruction. We know what needs to happen. We've done it, and we're ready to do it again.
Of course, part of the battle for you, I suppose, when you travel the world, it's financing and how to get people to invest, as you say, in these bricks and mortar projects. You talk about the private sector, a private sector that's drawn more and more towards artificial intelligence and techfin, the finance of technology. How hard has it been fundraising this year? Was 2025 an annus horribilis for you?
Look, it's no doubt ODA is under strain. We've seen the largest declines in ODAs for 30 years. And it's not necessarily being replaced by TechFin. It's just, how rich countries are behaving right now. The message is very simple. The long-term first best line of defense to instability is development, is jobs, is an economy that is capable to deal with shocks.
But it's things like building data centers sucking up all the money?
That's not necessarily the same money. I don't think we are competing with, that data center monies for development. I think the question that is very important is how do we use technology, how do we use AI to generate more development, to become more effective, more efficient, and to make economies more productive. That's one thing that we're trying to do, working with governments to create the right governance to AI and to other elements like that, but to make sure that economies in the developing countries that have very low computing power, that have no data centers, are not left behind. Technology, digital technology, can be a great asset to close inequalities among countries and within countries. But it can also exacerbate the inequalities that we see. What we are trying to do in the United Nations Development Program is working with governments to limit the risks, maximize the benefits to all. Let's not forget, 2 billion people in the world have no access to the internet. This conversation for those 2 billion people is irrelevant. We have to figure out how do they get to the internet first. Then we deal with the other issues. And I think that's where we are dealing with in terms of technology and AI, and we have a very robust program supporting governments around the world.
But we saw recently India hosted a big AI summit, and at that summit, the conversation that you are calling for came up of how do you agree on a global governance, but you also had the big players from the Silicon Valley. Is that letting the fox in the henhouse? If they're ones that stand to profit, are the ones helping to make the rules?
You can't forgo the presence of the biggest players.
Who makes the rules is my question.
Well, I think in the end of the day, governors need to make the rule. The Secretary General just appointed a scientific panel on AI with 40 people from all over the world. But realistically speaking, you can't create a global governance on AI and technology without the players. You have to have a conversation with them. They have to have on the table. But in the end, it is the governments that govern AI. or should govern AI. And I think hopefully that's where we're going in that sense.
That's where we're going, and that's where you hope to go. Again, what's it been like the past year?
I think the UN is doing its best to move towards that direction. There was something approved last year across all member states of the UN called the Global Digital Compact. And I think we are trying to move to implement the Global Digital Compact. And that's a mandate that comes from 193 member states of the UN, right? So we know a path forward. And we hope to convene, which is what the UN is excellent at, to convene and to bring all players, governments and the private sector, to try to find the best way to regulate AI. I also think the last few weeks and the last few scares coming from the industry itself about AI has perhaps given us an opportunity to pause and to look at how we're going to govern.
Are you referring to Anthropic saying that it should be humans who make the decisions on a kill order in times of war?
I'm talking about all different types of companies that have started to say we need guardrails on this, and scientists of companies that have resigned because, they are uncomfortable with this. I think there is a moment in here that the private sector, the players that you talked about, and governments might not be in the opposing ends anymore. There might be a consensus of what needs to happen. We're not there yet, but I hope we can get there.
Now, the United Nations has a yardstick for how agencies like yourself are doing, and that is the global poverty rate. That poverty rate had gone down. What is it now? A poverty defined by whether you earn, extreme poverty defined by whether you earn something like $2 and $3 now, $3 a day. How's that going at the outset of 2026?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We have seen a trend on poverty increasing that hadn't happened for a long time. For us as UNDP, we run for 33 years something called the Human Development Index, which is a very important index that measures human development, human progress beyond just GDP, right? And we've seen for the first time in 33 years since COVID a decline across the board in human development. That is why it's very important.
How do you attribute it to? What do you attribute it to?
I think there was COVID and there is, geopolitics, conflicts increases. I think we're living in a moment in the world with a lot of conflicts. All of those things are causing a turn on human development, which means it's more than ever for developed countries, France and other countries, not to forgo ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, not to forgo their solidarity to this process, because it is important to come back to the table and recognize that in the economy that we live today, completely interlinked, you can't solve the problems of the world in isolation anymore. We have to come together.
One final question on this. Marcos Neto, if there is one way in which that trend, that alarming trend when it comes to extreme poverty can be reversed, where should the focus be? Again, since we've seen countries like France here in Europe where money for development has instead gone to beefing up defense in the past two years, where would you ask them to put the money? Jobs
Creations in developing countries. Help developing countries join new and emerging supply chains like green energy and other aspects, and invest on those, letting developing countries process rare minerals and allow for, rather than just a commoditize and exporting, to happen an industrialization in the African continent, in other parts of the world, that will create jobs. And that will create supply chains for the green energy, for electric vehicles, for everything else that we need. There is an opportunity here with the transition to decarbonization that we can look at this in a different way than we've looked at in the past. And I think for me, investing in the creations of jobs in developing countries with youth populations, and then allowing those countries to be, or inviting those countries to be part of supply chains will be very important.
Jobs in what sector are you talking about?
The green energy sector, new infrastructure on rare earth minerals, on AI, all of those aspects. I think there's a tremendous opportunity. You know, if you look at the nationally determined contributions that country have prepared for the Paris Agreement and submitted in Belém last year in Brazil, you know, those agendas that are domestic agendas are no longer a climate agenda. They are development agenda. And in those plans, there's a lot of jobs to be created, right? And I think there's a tremendous opportunity of mutual self-interest between developed countries and developing countries to create those jobs while at the same time preparing economies to become more resilient for what we know is a world unstabilized by climate change.
Climate change that we've been feeling here in Europe. Do you have any advice for Europeans when it comes to, I know it's not the main remit of the United Nations Development Program, but in that respect, what would you like to see bettered?
Well, I think European nations needs to invest in their own adaptation to the climate change. They have to transition to energies which are cleaner, right? And then they have a solidarity to the rest of the world to allow for that revolution that is happening on energy transition and others to reach all the corners of the world.
There's pressure on the European Commission to push back rules for deadlines for doing that green transition.
I think it is in the self-interest of Europe to stick to what it knows is the right approach. You know, I think that's what is important for us to all provide the support in that sense.
Marcos Neto, UN Assistant Secretary General Director of the UNDP's Bureau for Policy and Program Support. Thank you so much for being with us here on France 24.